My name's Daisy Yee. I just turned 19 and I live with my folks in this big old house out in California. We're pretty comfortable. Never really had to worry about food or money, you know? My dad's a real estate agent. Kind of a rugged-looking guy, but real brave. And my mom, she's a sweet, gentle teacher, always looking out for us. Life was pretty smooth sailing in that cozy house of ours, until one day, bam, everything just flipped. It was a gloomy afternoon. Real dark clouds rolling in like something bad was about to happen. Mom and I were in the kitchen making dinner, waiting for Dad to get home. After a long day, that kitchen was just warm, you know? The smell of Mom's soup, it was filling the place, making it feel all nice and cozy, even with the cold wind outside. But then the phone rang, and it just shattered that whole vibe. It was Dad calling. I froze as Mom picked up, and in just a few minutes, everything just changed. Dad's voice was shaken, nothing like his usual confident self. He told us his company went belly up, no money left, and they had to sell the house to pay off the debts. Those words hit us like a ton of bricks. Everything we had, even the house we grew up in, just gone. Mom, she tried to keep it together, but I could see the worry in her eyes. Dad, he just sounded tired. Told us we had to go back to the village, live with Grandpa. At least we'd have a roof over our heads there. I was stunned. Grandpa's village, I barely remembered it. After Grandma passed, he lived alone in this old house. My memories of him were kind of fuzzy, just little snippets of him playing with me, being all sweet. But it had been so long since I'd seen him, I could barely picture him. The next morning, we packed our bags and left our old life behind. Just me and Mom in the car. Dad had disappeared after breaking the news. We drove down this long road, watching the scenery change from tall buildings to dirt roads and wide open fields. It felt empty, quiet. We finally got there, and there it was, this old house. The roof was faded, the walls were cracking, showing the old bricks. Big garden, though, full of fruit trees. I got out of the car, feeling kinda uneasy in this strange place. Then, the front door creaked open, and there was Grandpa, a little hunched over. His deep eyes looked older than I remembered. He smiled when he saw us, especially me. It was like he remembered me being little, but there was something else in his eyes. Not just the old warmth, but something intense. I didn't think too much of it. Figured he was just getting old. We said hi, and he welcomed us in. The house was old, the furniture was simple, but he'd cleaned everything up, made beds for Mom and me. It was different from our old place, but it felt warm in its own way. The first few days with Grandpa were peaceful enough. He always checked on us, told us stories, helped Mom settle in. But as the days went by, I started to notice how he looked at me. It wasn't the same. Every time I looked in the mirror or read a book in the garden, I felt like someone was watching me, and when I turned, there he was, staring at me. But not with that warm, familiar look. I figured maybe it was because of the clothes I wore, the city clothes. I was used to wearing comfy, light stuff. Maybe he just wasn't used to seeing me like that. I told myself it was just the difference between city and country living. One afternoon, Mom went out. She headed to the city to help Dad with some stuff. So, it was just me and Grandpa. I was sitting on this old sofa in the living room, reading a book. The sun was shining through the window, making the room all dreamy and quiet. I was lost in my book, didn't notice Grandpa coming in until he was right there. He had a plate of fruit, all cut up nice, apples, pears, oranges. He came over and put it on the table, smiling. His voice was warm. "Here, have some. I just made it. Fruit's good for you." I looked up, smiled, and said, "Thanks, Grandpa." I grabbed a piece of apple, took a bite, and went back to my book. I was grateful for his little gesture. He was always so thoughtful. But I couldn't help but notice he sat down in the chair across from me. His eyes were fixed on me. At first, I thought he was just resting, but then the silence got kinda awkward. He just sat there, looking at me. I tried to focus on my book, but his stare was like a wall between us. After a while, he broke the silence, his voice low. "You've grown up so fast, Daisy. Seems like just yesterday I was holding you in my arms, and now you're this beautiful young woman." I looked up at him, forced a little smile, and said, "Yeah, time flies, Grandpa." I answered softly, my cheeks getting warm. His eyes were looking at me in a way that wasn't like the old Grandpa, not warm and sweet, but something else, something that made me uneasy. He kept talking, his voice low, like he was thinking out loud. "You're getting more beautiful every day. Those eyes, that face just like your mother when she was young, so beautiful. But you've got your own Ethan special, something unique." I gave him a weak smile, trying to hide the unease growing inside me. "You're just saying that I'm nothing special," I said, my eyes still on the book, trying to stay calm. But inside, I was feeling weird about all the compliments. I was confused, didn't know how to react. He kept going, like he needed to say it. "I used to carry you around the garden, remember? You'd talk about everything. And now, in just a few years, you're this beautiful young woman with such a pretty face." I gave him a weak smile, my mind filled with unease. "Yeah, I remember. It was fun. You always took care of me." He kept looking at me, never looking away. "You're not just beautiful. You're attractive too. Boys must be going crazy for you. I just want someone to take good care of you." I blushed, looking down, my hands shaken as I turned the pages of my book. I wasn't really reading anything. His words were making me feel all mixed up, didn't know how to respond. "I'm still young, haven't thought about that stuff," I answered softly, trying to stay calm. Grandpa smiled, looked at me for a moment, then stood up. "Yeah, you're right. You keep reading. I'm gonna go out to the garden." He left the room, leaving me there. I sighed in relief, like a weight had been lifted. After he left, I looked around the room. Everything was quiet again, but something was still bothering me. The book in my hands felt pointless. My mind wasn't on the words anymore, just on Grandpa's eyes and his words. Those compliments, even though they were soft, had something in them that made me think. After that conversation, things got even weirder. Grandpa's eyes weren't warm anymore. There was something in his stare that didn't make me feel comfortable. I tried to ignore it, told myself I was just imagining things. But honestly, every time he came near, I felt this anxiety, this confusion. Then one morning, Mom went out again. She said she was going to the city to help Dad with some important stuff. So, it was just me and Grandpa at home. I felt uneasy about being alone with him, even though I didn't want to admit it. I could see something was off with him. It wasn't just his eyes. Sometimes he'd do things I couldn't understand. After Mom left, the house got real quiet. Usually, I'd see him sitting in the living room or the garden, giving me a quick glance now and then. But that day, he seemed to want to be closer, and it made me uneasy. That was the third day Mom was gone. The afternoon was peaceful, the sun shining through the trees, making these sparkly spots on the ground. I was sitting under the fruit trees, reading a book, like always. Grandpa's garden was real pretty in the afternoon, birds chirping, a gentle breeze blowing through the leaves, but that day it just made me more nervous thinking about Grandpa. I was trying to focus on my book, not thinking about anything else, when I heard this weird sound behind me. It was soft, like footsteps on the grass. My heart started pounding. I slowly turned around, and there he was, Grandpa, coming towards me. He was walking slow, but steady, his eyes never leaving me. I felt this anxiety in my chest, couldn't take my eyes off him even though I wanted to run. He got closer until he was just a few steps away. I tried to stay calm, but I was tense. "Grandpa?" I said, my voice shaking a little. He stopped right in front of me, staring at me with this look I'd never seen before. His voice was deep, but it felt off. "I like you, Daisy," he said. I was stunned, my mind spinning. I couldn't believe what I'd just heard. He kept talking, his voice steady. "In my whole life, I've never seen a girl as beautiful as you. You're perfect. Your eyes, your skin, your smile. I just stood there confused, not knowing what to say. My heart was pounding, my whole body frozen. I couldn't look away, but I couldn't say a word either. Those words, coming from the grandpa I used to look up to, felt like a punch in the gut. He stood there, his eyes locked on mine, full of something I didn't understand. I could feel his breath. He was so close. You know, he kept going, his voice full of something else. You've grown into this beautiful young woman, and I can't help but notice. I still couldn't say anything, my feet stuck to the ground. My mind was racing, but I couldn't find a way out of this. I felt like I was in a weird dream, where everything was blurry and scary. You shouldn't say that, I finally managed to say. He moved even closer, until I could feel his breath on my face. My heart was pounding, my feet glued to the ground. When he was right in front of me, he reached out and took my hand. I shivered, his rough skin making me tremble. He whispered, his voice heavy, "Daisy, you know I want you. I want you to be mine." He squeezed my hand, and I could see it in his eyes. Not the love of a grandpa, but something else, something I never expected. I panicked, trying to pull my hand away, but I wasn't strong enough. My mind was spinning, trying to find a way out. "Grandpa," I said, my voice shaken but firm. "You shouldn't do this. I'm your granddaughter, we can't." He looked at me, surprised, a little disappointed. "But Daisy, I've been thinking about this for a long time. You're grown up now, a beautiful woman. I just want to be with you, protect you, love you like I've never loved anyone before." I took a step back, my hand still shaken. "Grandpa, I can't. I'm your granddaughter. We can't do this. Please stop." He went quiet, his eyes shifting from something else to a distant sadness. He slowly let go of my hand and stepped back. He looked down, his voice full of guilt. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have done that. I don't know what came over me." He looked at me one last time, his eyes full of regret, then turned and walked away. He disappeared behind the trees in the garden. I stood there, frozen, not knowing what to do. My heart was still racing, fear still hanging in the air. When he was gone, I finally breathed a sigh of relief, like I'd just woken up from a nightmare. From that day on, I couldn't even look at him. Every time he was around, I'd try to avoid him. I was confused, scared, didn't know what to do or if I should tell Mom. But I felt this distance growing between us, and I was worried. Luckily, Mom and Dad came back soon after. Mom walked in with a smile, said everything was fine in the city, Dad's work was back on track, and we could go home. I looked at Mom, feeling this relief wash over me. Everything was going to be okay. I didn't have to be scared around him anymore. Dad came back a little later, smiling, said everything was back to normal. We packed up to leave Grandpa's house and go back to the city. I felt this mix of sadness and relief. I'd never forget those days, how everything changed, from Grandpa's eyes to his actions. But now, as I got in the car, sitting next to Mom, I felt safe, grateful that it was all over. As we were leaving, I caught Grandpa's eye. He looked sad, deep, like he was trying to say something, but couldn't get the words out. He didn't dare look me in the eye, just stood there, watching from a distance. I didn't have the courage to face him either, not after everything that had happened. I had all these mixed feelings, fear, worry, but also a little sympathy for him. I knew he was wrong, but he probably felt bad too. Still, I couldn't forget those moments, how sudden and confusing it all was. Things between us would never be the same. We both needed time to heal, to fix what was broken, if that was even possible. The car started, the engine breaking the silence of the garden. I looked out the window at Grandpa again. He was standing there alone, in the middle of the yard, his gray hair blowing in the wind. I could feel the loneliness around him. He'd been living alone for so long, and now he was going back to that silence. I sighed, feeling guilty and sad, He was still my family, the grandpa I used to love. But now, there was this distance between us, and I didn't know how to fix it. The car rolled on, leaving that old house behind. I turned to look ahead, trying to push away all the thoughts in my head. On the way back, I didn't say a word. Mom sat next to me, smiling, asking how the past few days had been. But I just gave her quick answers, then stared out the window. The scenery passed by, but all I could see was Grandpa standing in the garden, his eyes sad and unforgettable. After my story, I want to tell everyone to always respect boundaries in relationships, even with family. Family is important, but respect and personal space should always come first. If something makes you uncomfortable, speak up. Silence can make things worse and cause long-term damage. The most important thing I learned is to listen to your gut and don't let anyone cross your boundaries. If you feel unsafe, ask for help from someone you trust. Always protect yourself and keep your relationships based on respect. Back in the city, things felt different, like I was walking on eggshells. Even though everything was back to normal, I couldn't shake off what happened at Grandpa's. It was like a shadow following me, making me jumpy. I tried to act normal, smile and laugh with Mom and Dad, but inside I was a mess. I kept replaying those moments in my head, Grandpa's eyes, his words, the way he touched me. It was like a bad dream I couldn't wake up from. Days turned into weeks, and I started avoiding places that reminded me of him. Even the garden in our backyard, which used to be my favorite spot, felt tainted. I'd stay in my room, reading or listening to music, trying to block out the memories. But they kept creeping back, like a ghost in the corner of my eye. One afternoon, Mom came into my room, looking worried. "Daisy, honey, you've been acting strange lately. Is everything all right?" she asked, sitting on the edge of my bed. I looked at her, trying to find the words, but they just wouldn't come out. How could I tell her what happened? How could I explain what Grandpa did? I didn't want to hurt her or make her see him in a different light. He was her dad, after all. "I'm just tired, Mom," I said, giving her a weak smile. "Been studying a lot for exams." She looked at me, her eyes full of concern, but she didn't push it. "All right, sweetie, but if something's bothering you, you know you can always talk to me." I nodded, feeling a pang of guilt. I wanted to tell her, but I was scared. Scared of what she'd think, scared of what would happen. A few days later, I got a letter in the mail. It was from Grandpa. My heart started pounding when I saw his handwriting. I tore it open, my hands shaking. He wrote about how much he missed us, how lonely he was in the old house. He asked how I was doing, if I was happy back in the city. He even mentioned the garden, how the fruit trees were blooming. As I read his words, I felt a mix of emotions. Sadness, anger, confusion. He sounded so normal, so Grandpa-like. But I couldn't forget what he did. I couldn't pretend like nothing happened. I wrote back, keeping it short and polite. I told him we were fine, that I was busy with school. I didn't mention the garden or how I was feeling. I just wanted to keep my distance, to protect myself. Time went on, but the memories didn't fade. They were always there, lurking in the back of my mind. I started having nightmares, waking up in a cold sweat, seeing Grandpa's face in the dark. I felt trapped, like I was living in two different worlds, one where everything was normal, and one where I was haunted by the past. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I was sitting on my bed, staring out the window when I heard a noise downstairs. I went to investigate and saw Mom sitting at the kitchen table, looking through some old photos. I sat down next to her and she smiled at me. "Look at these, Daisy," she said, showing me a picture of Grandpa holding me when I was a baby. "He always loved you so much." I looked at the picture, feeling a lump in my throat. I wanted to tell her everything, but I was still scared. Instead, I asked, "Mom, have you ever kept a secret?" She looked at me, her eyes serious. "Sometimes, honey. Sometimes we keep secrets to protect the ones we love. That night, I made a decision. I couldn't keep this secret anymore. It was eating me up inside, making me miserable. I had to tell someone. The next day, I called my best friend, Sarah. We met at our favorite coffee shop and I told her everything. I told her about Grandpa, about his words, about how he touched me. Sarah listened, her eyes wide with shock and anger. When I was done, she hugged me tight. "Daisy, that's not okay," she said. "You need to tell your parents." I nodded, feeling a sense of relief. I knew she was right. I couldn't keep this to myself any longer. That evening, I sat down with Mom and Dad in the living room. I took a deep breath and told them everything. It wasn't easy, but I got through it. Mom's face turned pale and Dad's jaw tightened. They were shocked, hurt, angry. But they listened, and they believed me. After I finished, there was a long silence. Then, Mom stood up and hugged me, holding me tight. "Oh, Daisy," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry. I had no idea." Dad put his arm around us, his face full of pain. "We're gonna fix this, Daisy," he said. "We're gonna make sure he never hurts you again." We called the police, and they came to our house to take a stat. It meant I had to relive the whole story, telling them every detail. It was hard, but I knew it was the right thing to do. Grandpa was arrested the next day. I didn't see him, but I knew he was gone. The next few weeks were a blur. There were interviews, court hearings, and a lot of tears. But through it all, Mom and Dad were there for me, supporting me every step of the way. I started seeing a therapist who helped me process what happened. She taught me how to cope with the memories, how to heal from the trauma. It wasn't easy, but slowly I started to feel like myself again. I started going back to the garden, spending time with my friends, and even laughing again. The nightmares faded, and I started sleeping better. I learned that keeping secrets can be more harmful than telling the truth. I learned that even family can make mistakes, and that it's okay to ask for help. And most importantly, I learned that I'm stronger than I thought. That I can survive anything, as long as I have the love and support of the people who care about me. A few months later, the trial was over. Grandpa was found guilty and sentenced to prison. I didn't go to the sentencing, but I heard about it from Mom and Dad. They said he looked different, older, smaller. There was no sign of the man I used to know, the man who used to make me laugh and tell me stories. He was just a shell of himself, a broken man. I didn't feel any joy or satisfaction, just a deep sadness. It was like a part of me died that day, a part of my childhood, a part of my innocence. I knew I'd never be the same, but I also knew I had to move on. I couldn't let what happened define me. I focused on school, on my friends, on my future. I started volunteering at a local shelter, helping kids who were going through tough times. It felt good to make a difference, to give back to the community. It helped me heal, to know that I wasn't alone, that there were others who had suffered too. One day, I got a letter from Grandpa. It was the first time he'd written to me since he went to prison. He apologized for what he did, said he was ashamed of himself. He said he loved me, and that he hoped I could forgive him someday. I didn't know how to respond. I didn't know if I could ever forgive him. But I decided to write back, to tell him that I was trying to understand, that I was trying to heal. I didn't mention forgiveness, but I didn't close the door either. A few years passed and I went to college, studying psychology. I wanted to help others who had been through trauma, to give them the tools to cope and heal. I wanted to make a difference in the world, to turn my pain into something positive. I didn't forget about Grandpa, but I didn't dwell on the past either. I visited him once, in prison. It was a strange experience, seeing him behind bars, looking so different. We talked for a while, about life, about the past, about the future. It wasn't easy, but it was as necessary. I left that visit feeling lighter, like a weight had been lifted. I realized that forgiveness wasn't about forgetting or excusing what happened. It was about letting go of the anger and resentment. about finding peace within myself. I never fully forgave Grandpa, but I did find a way to make peace with the past. I learned that life is full of ups and downs, of good and bad. But it's how we choose to respond to those experiences that defines us. I chose to focus on the good, on the love and support of my family and friends. I chose to use my experience to help others, to make a positive impact on the world. And I chose to forgive myself for not seeing the signs, for not speaking up sooner. My story isn't a fairy tale. It doesn't have a happy ending. But it's my story, and I'm proud of how far I've come. I'm a survivor, not a victim. And I know that no matter what happens, I'll be okay. Years went by, and I built a life for myself. I got married, had kids, and even bought a little house with a garden, just like the one Grandpa used to have. It was funny how things came full circle. I found myself planting fruit trees, teaching my kids about nature, and remembering those afternoons in Grandpa's garden. Sometimes, I'd think about him, wondering how he was doing. He was still in prison, getting older every year. I'd get letters from him every now and then, apologizing again and again. I never wrote back, but I kept the letters tucked away in a box in my closet. One day, I got a call from the prison. Grandpa was sick, real sick. They didn't think he had much time left. I hesitated, but then I decided to go see him. I owed him that much, at least. When I walked into the visitation room, he looked so frail, so different from the man I remembered. His eyes lit up when he saw me, and he reached out his hand. I took it, feeling the rough skin, the thin fingers. We talked for a long time, about everything and nothing. He told me stories from his childhood about Grandma, about how much he loved me. He apologized again, his voice weak but sincere. I didn't say much, just listened. I didn't know if I'd ever fully forgive him, but I knew I'd made peace with the past. I'd learned to accept that people make mistakes, even big ones, and sometimes the best we can do is try to understand, try to heal, and try to move on. As I was about to leave, he grabbed my hand and looked at me with those deep, sad eyes. "Daisy," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm so sorry. I wish I could take it all back." I looked at him, feeling a mix of emotions, sadness, pity, maybe even a little bit of forgiveness. "It's okay, Grandpa," I said, trying to smile. "It's okay." He smiled back, a weak, tired smile. "Thank you, Daisy," he said. "Thank you for coming." I nodded, squeezed his hand one last time, and walked away. I didn't look back. A few days later, I got another call. Grandpa had passed away. I didn't cry, but I felt a sense of closure, like a chapter had finally closed. I didn't go to the funeral. I didn't think I needed to. I'd said my goodbyes, and I'd made my peace. Life goes on, and so did I. I learned to live with the memories, to cherish the good ones, and to learn from the bad ones. I learned that forgiveness isn't always easy, but it's always worth it. And I learned that even in the darkest of times, there's always hope for healing, for growth, for a new beginning.